So we have come to the last session of the day. It's excitingly a public discussion. So we have two YouTubers, Nathan from the Digital Gnosis fame and EmersonGreen of the EmersonGreen. So what we'll have this session like this, 5 minutes for each, and then followed by 10 minutes of discussion between the two, and then it will be open for public discussion. Join me in welcoming Nathan.
Just to say, I think Philip sort of tacked this on just because, we were coming, and I think he thought it would be a useful platform to open up, further discussion afterwards for people. So if we don't have anything too substantive to say, just to sort of temper your expectations. I think Philip wants to get what our impressions are of, overall projects of exploring, panpsychism, philosophy of religion, panentheisms in this sort of non-standard way, you might say, or the relationship between the two. Emerson and I both come from very different sort of metaphilosophical backgrounds. My background is I'm very skeptical of metaphysics, such that I kind of don't buy into a lot of the assumptions that are required, I suppose, to get going with many of the problems. So I find like a lot of the stuff that was talked about today, from my perspective, very interesting. Like to understand what did Leibniz think about metaphysics, what would his views have been, what are the relevant trade-offs between certain considerations in the problem of evil, and how can we remove anthropocentric bias to think about theism. And I do think that there are, problems in philosophy of religion more broadly, where sort of biases that might have crept in for historical reasons mean that people focus too much on classical theism or standard problems or arguments for God, as opposed to thinking about a little bit outside the box, right? So I think I'm on board with the attempt to try and do that. I like the fact that people are independent and their exploration of these ideas by just trying to get at what do I actually think about, consciousness, the world, remove from these sort of disputes around the standard arguments in natural theology or something like that. I don't know that I have, I could talk about some of my thoughts on specific talks that people give, where obviously, I've got like disagreements with people, but I don't know that it would be too fruitful to do that because it'd just be so unfocused, because there's so much that's been said. And I think we can all sort of talk about that at the pub afterwards. From my perspective, though, like I said, I find it interesting, but it doesn't persuade me towards panpsychism. Those aren't my views in philosophy of mind. It doesn't persuade me towards any view on theism being true or Christianity or anything like that. But I'm very kind of skeptical of all of these projects from my own position. To make the case for that, I'd probably need more than the sort of 3 minutes that I've got. Maybe some of that will come out in a discussion Emerson and I have, going forward. And then I'm happy to kind of hand it over to you to give your overall.
Yeah, so I think that it is sort of these alternative models of God, or non-standard forms of theism, if that's what you want to call them, that, like, as I mentioned earlier, like lowered my confidence in atheism to the point where it was accurate to call myself an atheist at that point. So I think that, I don't know, I can't prove that the more commonly held forms of the value selection hypothesis and the hypothesis of indifference, I can't prove it, but I think that those are the result. I think they're popular, they're widely held, they're like commonly discussed for contingent historical reasons, and not because they're objectively more probable or something like that. So I'm happy that people are discussing obviously panpsychism, because I do accept panpsychism. I like lean in favor of it, I suppose. So you mentioned our kind of metaphilosophical differences, and I think your views sound. And for those who don't know, is it like vaguely pragmatist or something like that?
If we're looking to put things in categories, like, I guess that might be helpful, but it also could be unhelpful if people make like assumptions about what that means. So yeah.
Well, so some of the arguments we've had in the past, or some of the things I've heard you defend, it sounds kind of complicated and hard to wrap your mind. Like, oh yeah, maybe that's plausible, until we get to like specific concrete cases. And that's where I feel like it goes kind of off the rails. Like you asked earlier, you ask someone, okay, well, what if I don't even have the intuition that there's a hard problem? And I'm just like, how can you not have the intuition there's a hard problem?
Yeah.
Like, because when I hear that, I think like, okay, so what could that possibly mean other than someone gives you a physical description of a brain and you think that that is a complete explanation of why it's like something to be that brain? And that seems like it is clearly not the case. So what do you mean when you say, I don't even have the intuition that there's a hard problem of consciousness?
Right, right. No, that's a very good question. It is difficult to unpack. So, I mean, I think that, so one thing to sort of establish up front, right, is that we can sort of create questions that sound like they should have answers, right? So I can say, given that I'm north of the North Pole, and let's call this place, I don't know, New Johannesburg or something for some reason. How do I get to New Johannesburg, right? And that sounds like a question. I might be able to sort of think about various considerations around that question, speculate on them. But fundamentally, the frame that gives rise to the problem is a mistaken one, right? It's such that there's like no such thing. And it's a feature of our grammar that gives rise to us thinking that there is such a thing in the first place, right? Similarly, in philosophy of mind discourses, there's this word consciousness and other words, what it's likeness and so on, that exist for philosophers. But non-philosophers, it's not clear to me that they're inducted into using these words, right? And so, within philosophy of mind seminars, people are kind of inducted into ways of using these words, such that, maybe they're even inducted into ways of using these words through things like the hard problem, where they're told, there's this thing called what its likeness, but you can't accept explanations for that thing, right? And that's how they're sort of told to use the word. And I'm not saying it's that simple. I think the model's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's how people get to grips to it. Then philosophers will go on to say things like, we share the intuition that, or it's obvious that, and we think that. It's not clear what the relevant reference class is for we in these cases to me. If they're saying, I have the intuition that, I'm not sure that their having an intuition is a reason for me to believe something that they say if I don't share it. And I genuinely don't think I do share it. We can kind of explore what that exactly means a bit more. When they're saying we share the intuition, they mean, non-philosophers generally, or the folk, whoever the folk is supposed to be. I mean, I'm very interested in seeing any empirical data for that, because then maybe there is some kind of like ordinary language term or intuition that ordinary people would commit themselves to that they're talking about. And I'd love to kind of like, explore that. How do non-philosophers think that they're answering these questions? Or when we frame the questions in the likeness, consciousness, qualia, and and non-philosopher is just confused by the questions completely. And what can we say about people, people's ordinary intuitions as a result of that? And so I think that we set up a lot of the dominoes in the first place, and we get involved in all these disputes that are kind of like, based on this assumption, this assumption, this assumption, this assumption. I think right at the start, there's like a whole lot of stuff that needs to be carefully unpacked and explored.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't really care that non-philosophers don't understand philosophical concepts. Like, I don't really see the significance of that. That just doesn't really seem probative to me. Like, I think philosophers are kind of the relevant experts on certain subject matters, and non-philosophers don't know what philosophers are talking about. But I don't see how that's like significant. But with you, it's hard. I mean, it's a good practice, I think, in philosophical discussions to like find some kind of common ground, and then maybe work from there and try to reason from that point and see if anything can be like derived. And with you, I'm not even sure what that is. Like, I'm not sure like what common ground we could find, because you don't want to use like philosophical concepts. Like, it's like all of them are problematic. I can't I can't appeal to intuitions for justification.
Well, you sort of can. It's when, there's this thing of, it's when you sort of double count the intuition as like an additional reason, right? So it's like, do you believe that panpsychism explains consciousness or something? And, maybe there's additional reasons you can provide in favor of that, but let's say that's like rock bottom for you or something. And then you go, well, it just seems to me that way or something. Some premise somewhere up, the kind of argument chain, you go, well, it seems that way to me. But that seeming for me is like not an additional reason. It's like we just disagree about the statements we agree to.
Well, I mean, a few things about that. Like, all I'm saying is that intuitions confer some justification for a proposition.
Oh,
That's I'm not trying to double count evidence or justification. And I don't know. I don't know what it would be like to have an intuition that panpsychism is true. Like, that's such a higher order kind of truth. It would be very odd. I'm not sure what that would even be like. It would be like having an intuition that like Islam is true or something. Like I don't know what that would even be. Like I can have intuitions about self-evident. But yeah, with less basic truths.
Yeah, I guess yeah, we'd have to find out what the kind of relevant side are. I guess I don't have an impression that there are like more or less basic truths that there are intuitions about, that it's more or less, you know, for example, I mean, this was part of the discussion we were kind of having earlier. We might use the language of axioms as something in formalized languages. You know, axioms are supposed to be the things that other things are derived from. But when I reflect on my beliefs, my commitment to certain sets of axioms about formal languages is sort of held less closely than my commitment to, you know, the way that I would use some of the more standard ways that I might, you know, make moves in either like arithmetic or propositional logic or, you know, probability theory or something. Like I'm not so certain of these axioms and then I derive everything else. If I'm describing my own belief system, I'm like very certain of how I might think about a conjunctive probability or something like that. I'm not certain about like how we get there from Komorov of axioms or something. And so it's not like
You can work it out though.
Well, I mean, I could in principle, but I just don't think that's like a description of my belief system or my intuitions. Like it's not like I reach rock bottom there. I more reach like where I would say it seems to me that that's true in the way I learn to do things in a number of cases. I apply it day to day. Whereas if if someone who's a PhD in statistics came along to me and said, look, there's this really deep debate about different axiomatized systems, and I think this, and you think like that, I'm not going to go, well, I have an intuition that that's true or something. I would, dispute that, and I wouldn't dispute that. I'd accept their authority that they've got something to teach me.
I mean, I would say I have an intuition that, like, if you look at the individual Kolmogorov axioms, I'm going to say that seems self-evident. That's an intuition. And then you can work out from those axioms that something like, like errors in probabilistic reasoning, like the conjunction fallacy, where you can get people to say that they think one conjunct is like less probable than conjunction or something, or one disjunct, and that's incorrect. But I'm saying ultimately we're going to have to work that out, and we're going to have to rely on these fundamental axioms, which are justified by intuition. I don't know how else you would possibly justify like foundational axioms other than by intuition. And then we can like work out these higher order rules about them. That is kind of the bedrock of these axioms. And by the way, this was originally titled "The Skeptics Respond" because for obvious reasons. There was another skeptic that couldn't make it, and Philip was kind of supposed to be guiding it, and then it just kept changing. It was like the most continuous revolution, and then now it's just me kind of interrogating Nathan about his crazy views. But anyway, I think maybe we could open it up to other people. Not that you have to comment on what we're saying, but like bigger picture things about the conference, or just things that have been on your mind, because ultimately this is about what we're going to talk about when we're all getting drunk at the pub later. So.
What is it with the common ground thing? Because you were going to ask me about the hard problem, and I'm like, in my experience, I'm like you guys. I'm sort of a filmmaker from outside, and I my way around the lingo. I've been inducted. I like that word a lot. I know how to use the tools a little bit, but I'm pretty skeptical of a lot of them too. Which is why, and I don't know if it's successful for the common ground. Where I think so. My advice if I was on the panel as well is also that like maybe my presentation either way is I'm hoping to inject a little more art and psychology into philosophical theory of mind conferences that I've attended a few of that are fascinating and deep in the woods of the isms and with all the intuitions. But my starting point is like, is there a common ground with that concern, which is a psychological human nature with which, I don't know if you call it an intuition or not, but I feel like you're concerned about your bearings at least whether or not you grok the hard problem or think that's an answer to your concern. Is that a place to start of like concerned about our bearings, and then what the hell does that mean and how do we find them starts the entire story.
It does sound like a description of what's happening here. Like we can't agree on starting points, and then I think our disagreements are actually very fundamental, and it would take a long time to get to the ground level. I don't know who in analytic philosophy hurts.
I sort of am sympathetic to it. I think more said, like, yeah, I think we're both interested in maybe just understanding the way things are, and you could say that begins with a sense of curiosity or wonder or something like that. And yeah, I'm sympathetic to the project that you're trying to do in the sense that it tries to say there's this stuff that isn't being captured by the attempt to theorize and describe it, and like that art isn't the same as like a theory about the art or something and things like that. I think there's more to be, I could say about that, where we probably disagree as well, but yeah, I'm sympathetic to that stuff, and I do think it begins in a place of curiosity. From
an expert in fine-tuning.
I'm going to totally change the subject and not about fine-tuning. Is that all right?
Yeah.
As someone who talks to sort of astronomy people mostly and public astronomy, there are some questions, like I'm sort of surprised at the sort of questions people are interested in, and I get more than any often. As sort of the public face of philosophy, let me give you that halo. What surprised you that people are, maybe it's this and panpsychism, or like what are the masses interested in? Just to say, in astronomy, by a mile, aliens.
Yeah.
By a mile.
What are people interested in? Moral anti-realism, the moral argument for God. I'm trying to think of like more popular, and epistemology, surprisingly. Like I thought when I started talking about epistemology more on my channel, I thought that those were kind of just like for me and a handful of other nerds, and they ended up being like kind of popular. Like just speaking to Michael Huemer about phenomenal conservatism, or to Huemer as well about like meta ethics. A video, like a long video, like 2 hours long, it was like scripted, it's a dense video about meta ethics and the moral argument for God. And I think that's to date like the most popular episode. So I guess I wouldn't have thought that, because sometimes I'll make something I think is going to be really popular and no one cares. But yeah, it seems like meta ethics and moral realism versus anti-realism is super popular, and surprisingly, like epistemology, like relatively deep issues in epistemology.
Yeah, I think similarly that there's a lot of people who are sort of getting into philosophy through various avenues, and there's people who are definitely at like very different points in that journey along the way. For some people, it was, when LLMs came popularized and they start thinking about, well, what is language, or how do these things work, or how do I want to attribute like agency and personhood, and then they get involved in philosophy of mind. For some people, it's the sort of classic atheism v theism debates that were super popular, particularly in like the 2000s, and then that's their kind of avenue in. I don't know that anything is particularly surprising to me now, though, just because there's such a plurality of views and perspectives out there that like I don't know. I'm not really surprised by almost anything that anyone believes or says. I just try and engage with wherever they're coming from, persuade them of the truth of my position.
Our friend Cameron has proved that people are extremely interested in demonic possession.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
A lot of
Go back to the issue about ordinary concepts and philosophical concepts. Philosophers don't understand clearly philosophical concepts, and in particular, for the whole panpsychism and other theories of mind, it's the concepts of the physical and the mental. And I think there's a lack of clarity about them to start off with. And then there's also the issue about under what conditions can these concepts arise. And you get a lot of clues in that from developmental psychology and how children kind of grow up, and basically what happens is their ordinary engagement with the world is disrupted in some way. So they have an explanatory agenda, and they start realizing that there are some things which they thought or they wanted or they intended but reality didn't match up in one way or another. So they start to develop the concept of the mental as not necessarily being matched up by the physical. And there may be arguments that that looks like psychologically necessary conditions for the development of those concepts. There may be arguments for those being metaphysically necessary as well. But until we kind of get a real grip on what we mean by the concepts and how they're possible, I don't think you're going to get very much further.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I definitely think you should bring in like cognitive science and psychology into epistemology and other areas of philosophy that can help inform like the philosophical practice, even though I do think they're like ultimately separate. But yeah, no, I'm all for that. I love, like Descartes' Baby by Paul Bloom. It sounds like he pursued some of like what you're.
I think on that point as well, there are, I think, different methodological approaches within academic philosophy, but there's no sort of standard accepted approach. And this is sort of maybe one of my problems with contemporary analytic philosophy, right? Is that within other within other disciplines, there's like clearer standards for success, whereas within philosophy, it's not always clear what those standards for success are, which permits for such kind of disparate methods and, raises all these problems around what does philosophical progress even look like? Is it even achievable? What are we doing when we argue and talk about these things? And yeah, there's massive differences in whether people even think how people are going to answer that question, whether based on the assumptions they make, they might think interrogating the concepts that they have inwardly, as it were, is the appropriate disposition to take towards these questions to figure out where the boundaries on these concepts are. I suppose the approach that I'm advocating for is more that we should engage in a descriptive practice of finding out how these concepts are deployed in ordinary populations, and then, to sort of bring in a little bit of the thing that Emerson said about experts can have slightly different uses of words to ordinary speakers. Like, I think that's all right, and maybe we could argue for that, or we could prescribe that they should use them differently or something. But first, I think we want to get really clear about what it is that the way that those concepts are used in broader speaking populations, and then kind of engage in talk of like, well, what are the boundaries of this thing? How should we engage? Yeah.
The last question has reminded me of what I think is a devastating answer to panpsychism, which is the essentially and the fact that consciousness emerges in children of the social process. Electrons. They don't have parents. They don't get together. And I just wonder whether you thought that panpsychism, and I'm not saying your parents panpsychism, but whether you thought that panpsychism has an answer to that. There's a whole psychological tradition about what are the conditions for the emergence of consciousness, and a philosophical tradition about what are the conditions for the emergence of consciousness, which panpsychism appears to just ignore. And then says, well, fuck all that, we just think everyone's got it. So what's the answer to those psychological and philosophical traditions which say these are the conditions for the emergence of consciousness?
Well, I mean, you don't want to anthropomorphize consciousness too much, where you think, well, because I think it's fairly easy to conceptually separate like complex human psychology on one hand, so that you're having parties and so on, versus just phenomenal consciousness, which is very
well. I mean, the arguments are that without these conditions, you just don't get phenomenal consciousness. I mean, it's a meaningless concept. We don't know what that this primitive consciousness just doesn't refer to it. It's like the North Pole. It's something north of the North Pole. It's something that doesn't exist.
It might
we
not
have a word.
It might not refer to anything, like panpsychism might be false, but it's definitely not meaningless. It's not like conceptually confused to say maybe it's like something to be a very simple.
Right. I think that's where we disagree.
Well, I mean, I don't think anyone could object to panpsychism on the basis that I don't know what it means to say that it's like something to be like a single-celled organism. Like, I think you can, I think that the meaning of that is clear. Like, you can think that it's true or false, like most people think it's false, but I don't think it's meaningless. But it sounds like you're trying to push that to say, like, if you're applying phenomenal consciousness in simpler systems that don't have like complex human psychologies, then it's just meaningless to suggest it could be like something. But
how do we know about the concept of consciousness? Through some sort of introspection, through some sort of dealings with other people. That when we get it to start with, some sort of, like we do from anything else, we observe things, the concept of share. So we have a concept of consciousness. Then the panpsychists start to say, well, what's it like to be a bat? Well, we sort of just about guess that it's something to like to be a bat. And then they just carry on. What's it like to be an electron? And at this point, you stretch the concept of consciousness to the point I would suggest of meaninglessness. You can do that with any concept you choose to name. You can say, there's a concept, we're going to broaden its extension indefinitely. There comes a point when the concept has lost its meaning because you've extended it, you've made its extension so broad. I would suggest you may disagree with that, but it's not, that's the criticism. It's not that it's wrong, it's that it's actually meaningless.
maybe like one more and then.
Well, actually, Philip has something.
Live.
Live, yes. Where is it? There we go. In response to the question about it being meaningless to ascribe experience to particles, I think the onus is on the questioner to say which point of simplicity does ascribing experience to something become meaningless? Snails, bed bugs? And why is that point why is that point a point in terms of conceptual coherence? Okay.
I think there is a cutoff. Do you want me to answer to that?
I reckon, yeah.
I think that the answer to that is that whether or not I can actually define the cutoff doesn't actually bear upon whether there is a cutoff point. So what I'm saying is there is a cutoff point, but I don't actually know whether it's at the level of dogs, snails, electrons, but I'm pretty sure that it's above electrons, and it's below humans. It's somewhere in that middle. But it would require quite a lot of knowledge of psychology, quite a lot of conceptual analysis to define where the precise cutoff was. The fact that I can't do that now doesn't mean that there isn't a cutoff. Any more than the fact that I don't know exactly where an object is means that the object isn't somewhere.
Well, I mean, if you're going to say it's meaningless, then at some point you're going to, you might be committed to being, well, it's meaningless to say that snails have consciousness. So, I mean, I think the onus is on you to like come up with some kind of theory as to why, like it's meaningful to say that, a snail has consciousness, but it's meaningless to say that a worm could have consciousness. I mean, I don't know what an argument for that would even look like. Because it's not.
What I'm saying is it may or may not be meaningless to say a worm has consciousness, because we may know what we mean when we say it. But it's definitely meaningless to say that an electron has consciousness, because I am sure that the cutoff point comes somewhere between us and electrons, but I'm not quite sure where the cutoff point comes.
Could I have a different question? Because I'm curious to hear, everyone is aware of the tensions in their own tradition, right? I guess you guys are part of a quite new tradition of YouTubing. If I set my students a 200-page reading, I will get a lot of money if I bet that none of them will do 200-page reading. But I've got students who will watch like a 12-hour right, podcast series of just someone talking. And I'm curious about the form and what your experiences of the form of doing that and what it does to you personally, your soul, your mind, however you think about yourself. I'd just be curious about your reflections, right? If Socrates just walked around the city, he was like, what do you think? What do you think? And just talking to people. We read a lot of papers. It's a very different kind of form. Right? Just curious about your reflections on the form of what you're doing.
He actually does like 9-hour streams, so maybe you should start with that.
It clearly happened though.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of different formats for different things, right? Like the very long ones, it's because if you're engaging with like a whole book, you kind of want to go through it in all one go sometimes, or you might want to chop it up or something. There's a number of things that go on, right? So people sort of do form parasocial relationships with people, and it's sort of that, those relationships are different to sort of normal relationships, but they can have some similarities in some ways, and that can create different effects, some of them positive, some negative. So, you know, on platforms like YouTube or the podcasting platforms, there's sort of selection effects and incentives to produce certain types of content that generate engagement. Those can be pernicious because it can undermine, you know, high quality content in favor of what's attention grabbing and clickbaity, or people can be sort of shaped by the audience that they form, such that over time they're like driven in a certain direction to have certain beliefs. I've seen this happen with many people who started off as, you know, just classical liberals and are now weirdly taking money from Viktor Orban, and sort of very odd how the relationship between them and their audience drove them that over time. It's also that, you know, the benefits are, I think, that outside of the academy, maybe there's exposure to a wider plurality of ideas than sometimes there is. So sometimes what's considered legitimate within philosophy is like within very strict guardrails, and then all sorts of problems come up when you're engaging with someone who's legitimately a flat earther, right? And they're not unintelligent, like they're consistent in their views, and you have to really go down these like rabbit holes to figure out, and it raises all sorts of questions about, you know, what is going on in disagreement, or how do you persuade people? That can sometimes be a lot deeper than if there's just kind of like two standard views that you're being offered, and it's like, here are the arguments for that one, here are the arguments for that one. So that's maybe one advantage, is that there's more of a plurality of views out there, and it can be, but there are like definitely downsides and disadvantages as well.
Yeah, no, fully second everything that you just said, but I was talking to Professor Simpson about this earlier, where it actually changes your views to put yourself out there. I mean, first of all, because it's very easy to be complacent and think you understand something until you try to talk about it and explain it to someone else. You can hear someone else talk about it and think that you get it. And then when you try to write about it or try to explain it to someone else, you realize there are huge gaps in your understanding, and like the arguments don't work as well as you might have thought they did if you were just listening to them. So that will actually change your views and kind of push you in different directions. And then you have people, you know, like there's a huge just wall of negativity constantly. Which you just kind of get used to, but it's like, even if you have a very like small platform, there are lots and lots of people who are constantly like talking to you, who like know you and you don't know them. And like, again, a lot of because people will get very angry on YouTube, and they will just, you know, type out a mean comment, something they would never say to you in person, obviously. But I'm not saying like boo-hoo, by the way. I'm just saying you get kind of like, you know, thank you. No, it's really not that bad, but it's just like when people are so hypercritical of you, it can make you a little more defensive, and that can come out in your writing and in your speaking sometimes, where you kind of are like preemptively getting angry and annoyed and like trying to cut off certain people and like certain types of objections before they're even made. And it might be like 90% of the people listening are like, what are you talking about? Why are you so mad already? So it's just, that's one thing I really don't like about it, is that it can influence like your train of thought and influence your views. Such that like, if you don't have like a snappy answer to a stupid question kind of thing, then that actually makes you, it like disincentivizes even having that view, which is why I'm so brave for being a panpsychist, really. Because there are so many snappy things to say to panpsychists, and it takes a while to like, you know, adequately defend yourself. So I think that on YouTube, there's like a huge pressure towards views that sound good in a sound bite, but you know, maybe you're very shallow. So that's just a horrible trend where it kind of makes everybody dumber. But yeah, the one positive part of that dynamic is that it has kind of helped me develop my views farther than I would have if I were just listening and reading. Because I would think that I think, oh, that's a great position and I understand it so well, and then you try to explain it to someone else who write about it, and you find out that that is not the case. So it's helped me out. Sounds like a good one. John?
Yeah, who make the best guests?
In my experience, Michael Humer specifically. Best guests.
You make
No, I'm so
you make the worst guess.
Well, either, like, you know.
Shoot. I mean, the worst guests are the people who are just trying to like win in like a WWE style like conversation, where they're just trying to make you look stupid and like kind of get their horde of followers to kind of swarm your comment section or something like that. I hate those, so I'm like kind of selective about who I talk to, because if you were critical about it, you might say I give softball interviews or something where I'm just kind of agreeing with everything the person I'm interviewing is saying, because I think you kind of get more of them that way. So anyway, those are the ones that I really don't like, the people who try to like win the conversation, and that's a special type of hell because it's not like a an Oxford style debate typically where you get 20 minutes and they get 20 minutes. It's just like you're constantly interrupting each other, and like I don't know how people watch those things honestly, but
yeah, I think it just depends on what your goals are and what you're trying to do with your channel. I mean, I can understand certainly the attraction of the blood sport debate type thing and why that can be entertaining. But
oh my god, like those Jubilee videos with like the
with like Ben Shapiro
those
debates,
are
25,
unbearable.
So I can understand like the entertainment perspective, right, on some of those things. I do think, one thing I'd love to see more academics doing is sort of like publicly communicating their ideas on platforms, because I think that so many good ideas do get lost in papers in the academy and sort of don't make their way out. And so then it becomes very easy for the discourses in online spaces, which arguably impact more people in the public space, to kind of like spiral in weird directions where there's very fundamental like misunderstandings in the way that they talk about or think about things. I mean, to give one example, a couple of years ago, there was this sort of knockdown argument someone would provide where they would say, I just believe in reality as opposed to you who believes in imagination, right? And it's like that doesn't stand up to scrutiny, but given that you both disagree about something, you both disagree about what reality is constituted by, so it's just rhetorical. And I think that if there were more, you'd get less kind of low quality stuff like that, and maybe more. But it's balancing that off with like what's the right level to communicate at as well, which sometimes academics, I mean, maybe if they're writing public facing books or something, they have more of an understanding of, but also sometimes for non-philosophers who might be interested, some stuff is just inaccessible or I mean, not just philosophy, theology, science, whatever. And yeah, it's a difficult thing. I mean, this is also partly why I'm definitely in favor of institutions and governments and things doing more to try and publicly communicate, and these ideas.
To be clear, is your slight frustration with at least some academics a lack of willingness, i.e. do you invite people and they say no? Or is it you invite them, they come on the show and no one can understand a bloody word they're saying because they're so inaccessible?
It's hard to ascribe motive. I mean, it could just be that academics are so busy with like publish or perish culture, right? That they have no time to do anything else other than just get the next paper out, right? And they can't be bothered responding to an email. But you certainly do get like a lot of, or it could be email systems at universities filter out email requests for interview. Like there's a lot of candidate explanations on the table, but it certainly is difficult to try and like get experts to talk about the subjects that they're interested in.
I will say like some free advice for academics who are talking on podcasts or YouTube channels. You should kind of have two people in mind when you're speaking. One is like a first-time listener who has who's very new, doesn't know what you're talking about at all, and also someone who has like read everything that you've written. I know that can be hard to balance, but like if you have just something for that first person and something for that second person, it will be like a much better interview if you have both of them in mind.
There is a question.
Go in the corner, but
I was going to say, in agreement to that, as in like, I think I'm probably the youngest person in the room, and just in terms of like why we access YouTube and stuff, a bit like you said, it's like it is access. Like access is such a big problem. Like being here has been such a blessing because I can basically read whatever I want because I've now got all the journal articles and stuff paid for me. But before, you just can't, and you just don't have access to read things. So I think, like they were saying, and I completely agree about encouraging people to go online. And I know it's difficult because you don't want to just like give all your work away because you're like, you've written these books, you've spent time. But I do think that's also why it's so shut off, is because of that. And I guess in a way, like, how can I get other people that also might be interested in it into like philosophy and stuff when it's so hard to access in that sort of sense?
Yeah, I feel like especially if some of these institutions are funded by tax money, I don't know why it's not kind of public access to begin with. Like, kind of already paid for it once. I don't know why I would pay for it again. I don't know I don't know how academics feel about this generally, but you can get academic stuff for free. I mean, I have like hundreds of books that are like, $500 probably that you can just kind of go to LibGen and then go to. But
Most British universities pay for open access for everything that we publish.
oh really?
So we are paying twice, but the university is paying such that the general public can read it.
Okay, cool. It feels like every like academic, or if I tried to just look at a paper, it's like, do you want to pay $40 for this?
Yeah.
For I'm like,
Yeah, so universities keep preprint versions on free archives.
yeah.
You can't get it through the journal, 'cause that's beneath a paywall, but you look at, there'll be an archive that every university, yeah.
Well, if there's no further questions.
2 minutes, so with that, why don't we thank them and